Hello, I'm Tom Kimmel. Thank you for that inflated introduction that I provided you. Stay with me and I promise you some Pearl Harbor facts you've never heard before about Pearl Harbor related spies, dupes, and traitors. But first, this. This graphic represents my 3 previous presentations to OSHA and the Christopher Wren Associations over the years. I love the speaker evaluation program here. I find it fun, interesting, and helpful. Accordingly, at the risk of being hoisted on my own petard, here are selected evaluations of my 2016 lecture. The most critical. Instructor has a problem, much too fixated on his grandfather. Let it go. He was overbearing with that thread. I would not recommend this course. Least critical. This was the best presentation yet. Don't change a thing. One of the best classes ever. Honorable mention. My only disappointment was that the instructor devoted all his time to the many people who lied and nothing on the many failed attempts by Kimmel and his staff to gain access to the critical magic messages, which is really the core issue. I hasten to add that magic was a code word for the decoding of any Japanese coded material. My favorite, the instructor moved around too much. Glad I brought my cane. Okay, on to my selected evaluations of my 2018 lecture. This may be construed as unkind. Mr. Kimmel's discussion was an outright smear of a number of highly respected and dedicated military officers and civilian leaders. Mr. Kimmel's presentation lacked balance in the extreme. The least critical. Felt like a participant in search of justice. Will sign up for any Tom Kimmel course. Honorable mention, very interesting, well documented. It would have had greater impact if the presenter were not a direct descendant of Admiral Kimmel. And my personal favorite, we expect a lot of the instructors, not all, walk on water. And my last talk in 2019. The most critical selected evaluation was this. I found Mr. Kimmel to be abrasive and not pleasing to listen to. A very self-serving lecture, angry, biased, nothing new. The least critical, excellent lecturer. This is the 3rd lecture I've attended on this subject, well planned, and I always come away with new information. Honorable mention, too personal. And perhaps his grandfather had to take the sacrifice to benefit the war effort. As President Roosevelt believed, many men lost more than that. They lost their lives. My favorite, the course requirement should have been to attend Kimmel's previous 2 lectures. Okay. Many of my evaluators suggested I should start with some Pearl Harbor background. So I hope this Canadian HBO trailer for Pearl Harbor the Accused helps. It's based on the book A Matter of Honor by Irish authors Anthony Summers and Robin Swan. In order of appearance, as shown on the graphic, are the characters Admiral Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Next would be Supreme Court Associate Justice Owen Roberts, chairman of the Roberts Commission. He would be followed by Admiral James Ace Lyons, a former commander of the Pacific Fleet. Next up is the actor for Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark. And last, my cousin Manning Kimmel, another Admiral Kimmel, grandson. I also appeared, but was left on the cutting room floor. So here we go.
Everyone had visions in their head of the devastation of Pearl Harbor. The deaths of 2,403 men, women, and children.
December 7th, 1941. Hellfire. Didn't we do anything? A date which will live in infamy.
The American people are in shock. Somebody had to be responsible.
Admiral Kimmel takes the blame.
In the minds of many, he let the country down.
You received this warning? Yes, I did.
Kimmel is beginning to realize that he's not being given all of the information that is out there. We've been managing a system called MAGIC.
It clearly indicated the Japanese intent to attack the Hawaiian Islands.
Kimmel didn't know anything about these messages on December 7th or the days before.
Mr. Justice, we know now what Washington knew, which was everything. But when your government turns against you, your ability to clear your name is strictly an uphill battle. Son of a bitches.
Well, did my cousin Manning sound a tad angry? At any rate, here's some more background. We're going to track the Kido Butai, the Japanese strike force, across the Pacific, starting on the 25th of November. The first thing to notice is that it started with submarines sailing from Japan as early as November 11th, 16th, and the 21st. 25 submarines in all. The 17-ship carrier strike force, known as the Kido Butai, with a 3-submarine screen, sailed on the 25th. That's the 25th of November. Very importantly, the 25th was a deadline set by Japan back on November 5th. It would be changed on the 22nd of November to the 29th of November. Both deadlines, of course, we knew about from our decoding of MAGIC. So here we go. On the 25th, Washington was engaged in a hot and heavy debate as to whether to send to Japan a modus vivendi or an ultimatum. A modus vivendi would have called for a 90-day cooling off period by both Japan and the United States. They could have sent a modus vivendi or a much more heated, worded ultimatum or American note. Again, the Japanese deadline for negotiations was changed from the 25th of November, set on 5 November, to the 29th of November, set on the 22nd of November. We continue on. On the 26th, Washington made up their mind and sent an ultimatum, an American note to Japan, not the modus vivendi. Continuing on to the 27th. The Navy Department in Washington, D.C. sent a war warning to Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii and Admiral Hart in the Philippines, the commander-in-chief of the Asiatic Fleet, which said that negotiations with Japan had ceased. Japan's attack was predicted in the war warning message on the Philippines, the Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo. Admiral Kimmel was ordered to be prepared to carry out his war plan, which called for the immediate move against the Marshall Islands to relieve the pressure on the British. Also on the 27th of November, the Army sent a warning to the commander of the Hawaiian Army Department, the Army Hawaiian Department in Hawaii, saying that there was the barest possibility of negotiations continuing. And it ordered the commander of the Hawaiian Department, Army Department, General Short, to report the measures taken. Continuing on, the 27th, the same day, two other dispatches were received by Admiral Kimmel that were affirmative evidence that the War and Navy departments did not consider hostile action on Pearl Harbor imminent or probable. One proposed that Hawaii send 25 Army pursuit planes by aircraft carrier to each of the islands of Wake and Midway. This constituted 50% of General Short's fighter planes. The other message proposed reinforcement of Marines on Midway and Wake Islands with Army troops. Continuing on to the 28th of November, Admiral Kimmel was again ordered by dispatch to be prepared to carry out his Japanese war plan if hostilities occurred. General Short, on 3 occasions, was ordered by General Marshall's adjutant, Adams, and intelligence chief, Miles, to protect against sabotage. As ordered, General Short sent Marshall his measures taken. That report stated, report department alerted to prevent sabotage liaison with Navy Rayurad 47227. In English, that meant that General Short was telling General Marshall that he was reporting that his Army Department in Hawaii was alerted to prevent sabotage and that he was conducting liaison with the Navy, referencing General Marshall's radio message number 472 on the 27th of November. Also on the 28th of November, magic messages, as you see here, concerning the deadline messages. Other magic messages concerning the deceit plan that the Japanese were concocting. And also messages decoded from the Japanese explaining their reaction to the November 26th ultimatum from the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. And of course, none of this information was sent to Hawaii. As a consequence, Kimmel dispatched, as suggested by the Navy Department, Admiral Halsey in the aircraft carrier Enterprise to Wake Island to reinforce Wake Island. We continue on to the 29th. On the 22nd of November, Tokyo sent this, and I quote, "It is awfully hard for us to consider changing the date we set in my message of 5 November. There are reasons beyond your ability to guess why we wanted to settle by the 26th of November. But if the signing can be completed by the 29th, let me write it out for you, 29th, we have decided to wait until that date. This time we mean it, that the deadline absolutely cannot be changed. After that, things are automatically going to happen. And of course, none of that information was sent to Hawaii. On to the 30th of November goes the Kyobutai. The deadline has passed. Magic messages and a trans-Pacific cable intercept indicate that the Japanese now are more interested in their deceit plan than they were in the Japanese diplomats actively negotiating. None of this information was sent to Hawaii. On to the 1st of December goes the Kyobutai. Magic messages concerning the deadline message were intercepted. The deceit plan messages continued to be intercepted, and the note reaction messages. Again, none of it sent to Hawaii. Also on the 1st of December, President Roosevelt directed that the Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Fleet execute as soon as possible President Roosevelt's 3 small vessels order. Immediately, as soon as possible, fit out 3 ships. 2 of them were sailboats. Make them look like Navy warships and sail them into what was believed to be the path of the Japanese fleet. None of that information was sent to Hawaii. Hawaii did note that newspapers there reported that negotiations with Japan were continuing, but that's all they knew. Also on the 1st of December, Tokyo sent to its ambassador in Berlin magic message number 985, which stated, the conversations begun between Tokyo and Washington last April now stand ruptured, broken. Say very secretly to Hitler and Ribbentrop that there is extreme danger that war may suddenly break out between the Anglo-Saxon nations and Japan, quicker than anyone dreams. Again, not sent to Hawaii. On to the 2nd of December. Hawaii newspapers reported again that negotiations with Japan are continuing. Nothing was sent to Hawaii from the Navy or War Departments. On to the 3rd of December. Magic message number 111. Tokyo ordered its Hawaii spies to report ships' movements in Pearl Harbor twice per week. The information was not sent to Hawaii. On to the 4th of December. Tokyo ordered their Hawaii spies thus: strictly secret, please investigate comprehensively the fleet bases in the neighborhood of the Hawaiian military reservation. Ladies and gentlemen, you should note that from August to December of 1941, 68 intercepted Japanese ships in harbor spy messages were sent to and from Tokyo and their Hawaii spies. None were sent to Kimmel or Short. On 5 December, magic message number 122, Tokyo ordered Hawaiian spies thus: we have been receiving reports from you on ship movements, but in the future, will you also report even when there are no movements? The Navy Department in Washington, D.C. promptly decoded, translated this message, but did not send it to Hawaii. Also on the 5th of December, magic message number 113, Tokyo ordered Hawaii spies, please report on the following areas as to vessels anchored there: Pearl Harbor, Manila Bay, and the area adjacent thereto. Make your investigation with great secrecy. Again, in accordance with the suggested plan from the Navy Department in Washington, D.C., Admiral Kimmel dispatched Lexington with Admiral Newton to go to Midway to reinforce Midway. Kimmel is now left with no carriers and no ability to strike the Kido Butai. The only offensive weapon that could strike the Kido Butai at that time would have been the Army B-17 bombers, of which General Short had only 6. Continuing on to the 6th of December, magic messages 901 and 902, the pilot message was received. The first of 2 time of delivery message was sent. The first 13 parts of the 14-part Japanese declaration of war in English was sent, received, translated. FDR telephoned Admiral Stark, but neither Stark nor Marshall recalled where they were the night of December 6th, the night before the Pearl Harbor attack, Saturday night. None of this information was sent to Hawaii. Also on the 6th, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ingersoll, sent a message to Kimmel to destroy documents now or under conditions of greater emergency. So Kimmel did receive this dispatch on December 6th. To destroy documents now or under later conditions of greater emergency. Admiral Kimmel's post-attack comment on this message was, "No emergency here." On to December 7th. Magic messages, number 902 and 907, the 14th part of the 14-part Japanese declaration of war, and the time of delivery message. Deliver the message exactly at 1 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, Sunday afternoon. Neither of these dispatches was sent to Hawaii. Marshall later sent a belated alert to Hawaii, which arrived, of course, after the attack. Admiral Stark did not send an alert to Hawaii. Accordingly, here they come, 183, first wave of Kate torpedo bombers, Kate high-level bombers, Zeke fighters, and Val dive bombers. The second wave, 167 aircraft, 35 Zeke fighters, 78 Val dive bombers, 54 Kate high-level bombers, for a grand total of 350 attack planes to Pearl Harbor. Okay. At this point, I think it's appropriate to insert a note about scapegoats. Magnus Linklater wrote a foreword to a recent book by Michael Scott called Scapegoats, 13 Victims of Military Injustice, in which Mr. Linklater offered that scapegoats are sought when reputations are at stake, when authorities, insulated from the realities of the front, make catastrophic mistakes and the worst happens, their instinct is to blame those further down the line while everyone else runs for cover. Pearl Harbor is a prime example. Okay, this chronology really tells you all you need to know about the Pearl Harbor story. Secretary of State Frank Knox wrote, and I quote, "Neither Short nor Kimmel at the time of the attack had any knowledge of the plain intimations of some surprise move made clear in Washington through the interception of Japanese instructions to Ambassador Nomura in Washington, in which a surprise move of some kind was clearly indicated by the insistence upon the precise time of Nomura's reply at 1 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, Washington, D.C. time. A general warning had been sent out from the Navy Department on November 27th to Admiral Kimmel. General Short told me that a message of warning sent from the War Department on Saturday night at midnight before the attack failed to reach him until 4 or 5 hours after the attack had been made. Of course, the best means of defense against air attack consists of fighter planes. Lack of an adequate number of this type of aircraft available to the Army for the defense of the island is due to the diversion of this type before the outbreak of the war to the British, the Chinese, the Dutch, and the Russians. Secretary Knox's report was known to Chairman Roberts, but not revealed to Kimmel and Short. Okay, here's the real story within the Pearl Harbor story. 9 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the President of the United States selected a sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice, Owen Roberts, to investigate the Army and the Navy only, and then only in Hawaii. 10 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were fired and replaced. 11 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Justice Roberts began his deliberations. He investigated for a grand total of 36 days. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, he filed a report with the President of the United States declaring Kimmel and Short solely responsible for the success of the Japanese attack and derelict in their duty. President Roosevelt signed the report that day, unredacted, and released it to the press. The press, of course, had a field day with that. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack. That would have been the end of the story, and all the American public would have known about the Pearl Harbor attack. Except for one man, Captain Lawrence Safford, the head of Op 20G, the head of Navy Communications Intelligence, indeed the revered father of Navy Communications Intelligence. Captain Safford thought Kimmel and Short were being framed. At great personal risk to himself, he went unannounced to visit Admiral Kimmel, living in disgrace in Bronxville, New York, a beaten, despondent man. Captain Safford knocked on Kimmel's office door, identified himself, and asked Admiral Kimmel if he had available to him in Hawaii the same information they had in Washington, D.C. prior to the Pearl Harbor attack from the secret decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications in a program they called Magic. Did you, Admiral Kimmel, have this information prior to the attack, which gave us in Washington, D.C. indications of the time, place, reason, and deceit plan to cover the attack? Did you have that information available to you in Hawaii? Admiral Kimmel, stunned, looked at Captain Safford and said, "Captain, what in the world are you talking about? What is magic?" Captain Safford explained. Kimmel took this information, turned into a fighting tiger that very day, got himself legal representation out of Boston, and the junior counsel that he had, Ed Hannafy, took Safford's information and actually wrote the enabling legislation, which he took to the Naval Affairs Committee. The Naval Affairs Committee was so impressed with what they read, they took it to the full Congress, and the Congress ordered the Army and the Navy to conduct further investigations, or there would have been no further investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack 47 days after the attack. And now, of course, the game is on. Here is the dark heart of the Roberts matter, the number 2 investigation. The Washington High Command falsely testified to the Roberts Commission that Kimmel and Short had the same magic information in Hawaii as they had in Washington, D.C. This false information did Kimmel and Short irreparable prejudice. The Washington High Command had an obligation as officers and decent human beings to rectify the prejudice to Kimmel and Short from such deplorable misinformation. They did not do so. Investigation number 3. Captain Safford revealed magic to the Hart investigation. Investigation number 4. Admiral Kimmel indirectly revealed magic to the Army Pearl Harbor Board after General Marshall had committed perjury before the board and ordered subordinates to do the same. Accordingly, Marshall was severely criticized. Investigation number 5, the Naval Court of Inquiry vindicated Kimmel and criticized his only uniformed boss in the Navy, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Stark, for not keeping Kimmel adequately and appropriately informed, as he had promised to do in writing on multiple occasions. Investigations 6, 7, and 8, the Clark, Clausen, and Hewitt investigations, tinkered at the margins. Number 9, the Joint Congressional Committee found no dereliction of duty. Okay. In an effort to avoid being overbearing and angry, I ask you to consider this. Is there a Julie or a Mike in the audience? If so, Julie, Mike, what day is it?
Uh-oh. Guess what day it is? Guess what day it is? Huh? Anybody? Julie, hey, guess what day it is? Oh, come on, I know you can hear me. Mike. What day is it, Mike? Leslie, guess what today is?
It's hump day.
Okay, what's the point? Well, here's the point. Don't ignore the obvious. And here's the obvious. General Henry Russell, member of the Army Pearl Harbor Board. There was nothing difficult about reaching conclusions. They were perfectly obvious. So much so, as a matter of fact, that they shouted at the investigators. I was convinced, wrote General Marshall, that no agency of the War Department could have been as inefficient and downright stupid as the Office of Army Intelligence desired the Army Pearl Harbor Board to believe it to have been. The December 7th, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, was a surprise. Can we agree on that? I liken it to the surprise experienced by this male leopard when Mama showed up. Incidentally, I ask you, was everyone in our Navy Department surprised Yeah, I'm asking. Anybody in the audience? Well, consider Captain McCallum before the Joint Congressional Committee. If there was anyone in the United States government who had all the information from MAGIC, it was Captain McCallum, Arthur McCallum, the head of the Far East section of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Senator Ferguson questioning Admiral Captain McCallum. Captain, were you surprised when the Japanese attacked us Sunday morning at Hawaii? I was not surprised at the Japanese attack, sir. Well, were you surprised that we were attacked at Hawaii on Sunday morning? No, sir. We continue on. Well, how about operations? Intelligence doesn't seem to be surprised. How about operations? That would be Admiral Turner, Chief of Naval War Plans, which is operations. Admiral Turner testifies to the Hart investigation. Admiral Hart, were you, Admiral Turner, surprised that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor? Admiral Turner, not in the least. Well, how about Admiral Turner before the Joint Congressional Committee? Vice Chairman, Congressman Jer Cooper, Democrat of Tennessee. Admiral Turner, did you ever think an attack would be made on Pearl Harbor? Admiral Turner, yes, sir, I did. As I testified yesterday, I felt that there was at least a 50-50 chance that we would get a severe attack on Hawaii. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this from the Joint Congressional Committee report of 1946. I quote, before the committee, Admiral Turner testified that he regarded an attack on Pearl Harbor as a 50-50 possibility. Assuming this to be correct, there can be little doubt, considering the position he held as Director of War Plans in the Navy Department, that he could have given the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet the benefit of his conclusion had he been disposed to do so. Admiral Turner's position would be indefensible were his estimate based on any information or intelligence he may have possessed. Well, as we shall see, prior to the attack, both Turner and McCallum had indications of the time, place, reason, and deceit plan to cover the attack. But wait a minute. Who's on first here? Who was supposed to alert Kimmel of the threat? Well, once again, Senator Ferguson questioning McCallum at the Joint Congressional Committee. Ferguson, Captain McCallum, if you wanted to alert Kimmel to an air attack upon Hawaii as an intelligence officer, that was your duty, correct? McCallum, no, sir. That duty was taken away from us in about February of 1941 and placed in the Division of War Plans. In other words, Captain Richmond Kelly Turner's Chief of War Plans Division. Okay. This brings us to our first Pearl Harbor-related spy and traitor, Alfred Dreyfus. In 1944, the Boston Herald styled Kimmel as the American Dreyfus. So how important is spying anyway? Supremely important. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves amongst those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys. heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face in their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to fear. Enter Whittaker Chambers. He was a Communist Party member in 1925 and a Soviet spy 1932 to 1938. He defected from the Soviet underground in 1938 and joined Time magazine for almost 10 years. President Ronald Reagan awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 1984. Whittaker Chambers wrote in 1952, and I'm quoting here, "In the persons of Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White, the Soviet military intelligence sat close to the heart of the United States government. It was not yet in the cabinet room, but it was not far outside the door. In the years following my break with the Communist Party, the apparatus became much more formidable. Then Hiss became director of the State Department's Office of Special Political Affairs, and White became an assistant secretary of the Treasury. In a situation with few parallels in history, the agents of an enemy power were in a position to do much more than purloin documents. They were in a position to influence the nation's foreign policy in the interests of the nation's chief enemy, and not only on exceptional occasions like Yalta or through the Morgenthau plan for the destruction of Germany, but in what must have been the staggering sum of day-to-day decisions." That power to influence policy has always been the ultimate purpose of the Communist Party's infiltration. It was much more dangerous and has, as events have proved, much more difficult to detect than espionage, which beside it is trivial, though the two go hand in hand. Consider what Arthur Schlesinger had to say about Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, his 1952 book. Schlesinger called Witness one of the greatest of all American autobiographies. President Reagan credited the book as the inspiration behind his conversion from a New Deal Democrat to a conservative Republican. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan concluded the complicity of Alger Hiss of the State Department seems settled, as does that of Harry Dexter White of the Treasury Department. Okay, Tom, but how does this relate to Pearl Harbor? Good question. Here's how. Adolph Burl was J. Edgar Hoover's counterpart at the Department of State. Isaac Don Levine was a journalist who collaborated with Soviet spy defector Walter Krivitsky, which led to a further collaboration with Soviet spy defector Whittaker Chambers. Levine tried to alert U.S. officials to Krivitsky's report that Stalin would join Hitler and predicted the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact of August 1939. Levine next tried to alert officials to Chambers' information about Soviet espionage in the U.S. In Witness, Chambers identified Harry Dexter White as part of his espionage apparatus, but wrote that he did not remember telling Burrell of White at their meeting on September 2nd, 1939, and thought he deliberately left out White because he hoped he had convinced White to break with the communist underground. Here are Burrell's transcribed notes, page 1 of 3. Again, this is from the September 1939 meeting of Burrell, Levine, and Whittaker Chambers. And Burrell titled his notes, Underground Espionage Agent. There's page 2, and it should be noted that the spies identified by Whittaker Chambers to Adolf Burrell in 1939 were later positively identified through the Venona Project and made public in 1995, but not until 1995. Venona was a code word for the secret American decoding of Soviet spy communications prior to and during World War II. Page 3 of Burrell's notes, Alger Hiss is identified. All this takes place in 1939, which is the important thing to remember here. A book titled Venona was edited by Robert Louis Benson, pictured here. Clearly a National Security Agency Venona expert. He gave a lecture in 2011 in which he said that Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. was surrounded by spies. When he walked into his office Monday morning, he would not have seen anyone who was not a Soviet agent. If measured by results, I ask you, what was the greatest espionage operation of all time, and who was at the center of it? Anybody? Well, here we go. Soviet spy Harry Dexter White, at the direction of KGB officers Akhmerov and Pavlov, wrote a hard-edged memorandum to Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, which was then largely incorporated into Secretary of State Cordell Hull's famous ultimatum to the Japanese on November 26, 1941. In the pre-war years, Harry Dexter White furnished secret Treasury information and documents to Whittaker Chambers, who turned them over to Soviet military intelligence. Soviet courier Elizabeth Bentley informed the FBI in 1945 that White passed information to the Soviets through Nathan Gregory Silvermaster, the leader of another Soviet spy ring. Here's how the Russians themselves, here's what they said about Operation Snow in 2002. Harry Dexter White was acting in accordance with the design initiated by Akhmerov and Pavlov. The essence of Operation Snow was to provoke the war between Japan and the United States to ensure the security of the Soviet Union. This is from the Independent Military Review, Russian Military Independent Review, January 2002. In more detail, here's what happened. Boris Bykov, a GRU illegal resident in New York, suggested that Ishak Akhmerov's illegals be used. Akhmerov was a legendary illegals officer in the United States in the 1930s and had remarkable success in corrupting Americans against their government. Jack Oviakimian, the New York NKVD resident, and I say NKVD because that morphed into the KGB, he suggested that Harry Dexter White be used. The Director of Foreign Intelligence for the NKVD, Lieutenant General Pavel Fitton, he not only agreed, but he wrote a spravka, a memo, in January of 1941, laying out a plan, which was approved by Beria, the head of the NKVD, and Stalin. Accordingly, Vitaly Pavlov was dispatched in May of 1941 to visit Harry Dexter White at the old Ebbets Grill in Washington, D.C. After Vitaly Pavlov suggested to Harry Dexter White what the Soviets wished the American foreign policy vis-a-vis Japan to be, in other words, hard line against Japan, Harry Dexter White drafted a memo in June of 1941, which in pertinent part looked like this. On its part, the Japanese government proposed to do the following: withdraw all military, naval, air, police forces from China, from Indochina, and from Thailand. Withdraw all support, military, political, economic, from any government in China other than that of the national government. Okay, why is that important? Well, here's why. In November 1941, the United States was engaged in a debate regarding a diplomatic response to Japan, sending a tough response or seek a 90-day delay. That would be the modus vivendi. Pursuant to all of this, on November 5th, 1941, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Stark, and the Army Chief of Staff, General Marshall, wrote a joint memo for President Roosevelt, in which they said the two were in accord in the following conclusions. War between the United States and Japan should be avoided while building up defensive forces in the Far East until such time as Japan attacks. Specifically, they recommend that no ultimatum be delivered to Japan. Interestingly, a copy of that joint memo was sent to Kimmel on November 14th. He actually received it in Hawaii on November 20th. What he didn't receive was the fact that President Roosevelt ignored the recommendation, the joint recommendations of Stark and Marshall, and sent the ultimatum anyway. Interestingly, General Marshall testified that if the proposed 90-day truce, the modus vivendi, had been effected, the United States might never have become involved in World War II at all. That a delay by the Japanese from December 1941 into January of 1942 might have resulted in a change of Japanese opinion as to the wisdom of the attack because of the collapse of the German front before Moscow in December of 1941. So, who favored the tough response? Well, in pertinent part, here is what Harry Dexter White's second memorandum looked like after Marshall and Stark recommended against sending Japan an ultimatum. This was written on November 17, 1941. And I don't have to read it again because it's perfectly obvious. It's almost identical to Harry Dexter White's memo of June 1941 that he wrote after his meeting with Vitaly Pavlov. That November 17, 1941 memo was forwarded by the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. I am enclosing a copy of a letter and memorandum which I am sending to the President. Sincerely, Henry Morgenthau. And, once again, in pertinent part, we have, on its part, the Japanese government proposes to do the following: withdraw all military, naval, air police forces from Japan, from China, from Indochina, and from Thailand. Withdraw all support, military, political, or economic, from any government in China other than that of the national government. This is all part of the Joint Congressional Committee record. And on the last page of the memorandum are the initials HDW, Harry Dexter White. Well, what's interesting about that? Well, what's interesting is that Harry Dexter White's name does not appear anywhere in the 40 volumes of the Joint Congressional Committee investigation. No one apparently put together the fact that Harry Dexter White, a Soviet spy, a known Soviet spy at this time, had written this document which influenced the American note of November 26, 1941. And here is Secretary Cordell Hull's November 26, 1941 American note to Japan. The language is strikingly similar to Harry Dexter White's June 1941 memorandum and November 17, 1941 memorandum. The government of Japan will withdraw all military, naval, air, and police forces from China. The government of the United States and the government of Japan will not support militarily, politically, economically any government in China other than the national government of the Republic of China. Here's an interesting side note. Admiral Stark's joint congressional testimony that he gave 2 years after his Naval Court of Inquiry testimony. Gerhard Gesell, interrogating Admiral Stark. The evidence here, Admiral Stark shows that Cordell Hull's note was intercepted in the regular course and was among the Japanese intercepts. In other words, the text of the note being transmitted by the Japanese representatives here in Washington to Tokyo. Admiral Stark's reply: that is true. I think that was on the 28th of November. Mr. Gesell, do you think you saw it then on the 28th? Admiral Stark, I could not be sure. I would like to say with regard to that 10-point note, while not recollecting having seen it at the time, that I had discussed in the State Department a memorandum by Mr. Morgenthau and expressed my opinion on it and confirmed it in writing. The note of the 26th, the 10-point note, as I recall, contained nothing, or at least very little, are only minor differences from the note of the Secretary of the Treasury, and also did not contain anything which I had objected to in the other note. So in general, I knew of the substance of that note, but as to having seen it in its actual form when it went out, or whether I saw it on the 28th, I could not say. Note well, Admiral Stark said he expressed his opinion on Harry Dexter White's memo and confirmed it in writing. Ladies and gentlemen, the investigator in me must ask, Judge Gazelle, why didn't you ask for that writing? Oh well, onward. The Army Pearl Harbor Board, after an extensive review, styled Secretary of State Cordell Hull's November 26, 1941, American note to the Japanese as the document that touched the button that started the war. The Japanese in Washington sent this document, that is Hull's November 26, 1941 note, back to Tokyo, which the United States intelligence promptly picked up through magic. But Stark testified to the Naval Court of Inquiry that he did not recall having seen it or having heard anything about it, and didn't have the slightest recollection of that note. This, of course, was his given reason why he did not tell Admiral Kimmel about it. Well, J. Edgar Hoover could speak with confidence on Soviet espionage because he was privy to Venona.
Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States.
By 1948, J. Edgar Hoover is fully aware of Harry Dexter White's espionage and seeks to find out why he did not know about it sooner. So he asks his head of counterintelligence, Assistant Director Mickey Ladd, to find out. And it's very interesting. This is contained in the book Venona, the NSA-CIA book Venona, at page 121. It's the memorandum from Mickey Ladd to J. Edgar Hoover, in which Hoover asks the question, do I understand correctly that Chambers talked to Burl in 1939? Why did we not interview Chambers sooner than May 1942? This memo in Venona, the Soviet espionage, the American response, 1939 and 1957, again by Robert Louis Benson and Michael Warner as editors. They include this entire memo of Ladd trying to explain this to J. Edgar Hoover. Here's the second page, third page, fourth page, fifth page, sixth page, and we come to page 7, which is noteworthy because the Bureau lists its own delinquencies, and you don't see that very often. Of note, the Bureau did not press Mr. Burl for information he might have had concerning Whittaker Chambers at the time he that would be Burl, made his inquiry to the FBI in March of 1941. There was an investigative delinquency in the period required for investigation of the background and activities of Whittaker Chambers from August 1941 to March of 1942. An explanation, if such exists, might be the general investigative delinquency in the field immediately prior to and subsequent to Pearl Harbor. Well, clearly this memo was never meant to see the light of day. Director Hoover's cursive comment is on the last page of the memo. Of course, hindsight is better than foresight, but we should learn from this incident and not have a recurrence in other cases or situations. This Venona intercept is illustrative of how much control Soviet spies had in the Treasury Department, and how difficult it was for our intelligence services to figure it out, even with the enemy's secret communication in hand, which is right here. In red are all of the Soviet spies. Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau in blue, and the NKVD officers listed are General Fitton, the famous illegals spy Akhmerov, and the writer of this spy communication, Fedosimov. So I'm going to try and interpret this to you, to give you some flavor for it. Okay. From New York, which would be Pavel Inovich Fedosimov, from New York. To Moscow, Lieutenant General Pavel Mikhailovich Fitton. Message number 79 of 18 January 1945. To Lieutenant General Fitton. According to Nathan Gregory Silvermaster's report, he may be presented with an opportunity of obtaining from Harry Dexter White Harold Glasser's appointment to White's post, as the latter will soon be appointed Assistant Secretary. Fedosimov's note. It is possible this is a slip of the pen, for White and others are already assistants. If Silvermaster is in Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau's department, where he obviously can be promoted to the post of deputy, Silvermaster has repeatedly suggested that Glasser be turned over to him. According to our information, he could get better results from Glasser than our line. He suspects that Glasser is connected with us through other American Communist Party channels. Ishak Akhmerov emphasizes that Glasser was passive in the Victor Perlo group, although he was able to give us valuable material. Some months ago, Silvermaster complained that Glasser was hiding important documents from Sonia Gold, his secretary. If we were convinced of Glasser's good faith toward the American Communist Party, Silvermaster would like to take him into his group. Silvermaster has always been against appointing two of our groups to one department, and instead asked that our agents from White's department be under his direction to avoid misunderstandings. In Akhmerov's opinion, if Glasser is reliable from our point of view, he ought to be turned over to Silvermaster. Silvermaster does not want to promote Glasser into his post, as it is possible that somebody else is already earmarked for it. Wire your decision by priority telegram not later than 21 January. indicating the method of establishing contact between Akhmerov and Glasser, if you agree to including Glasser in Silvermaster's group. Signed, Fedosimov. Well, so what was known about Harry Dexter White while the Joint Congressional Committee was in session in 1946? Well, we already know about Whittaker Chambers, but on May 1945, Whittaker Chambers finally details to the FBI the Soviet spies in the State Department, White House, and Treasury Department, to include Harry Dexter White. Chambers' 1939 warnings were basically ignored. On November 7, 1945, another Soviet spy, Elizabeth Bentley, identified Harry Dexter White as a Soviet spy. In November 1945, J. Edgar Hoover sent a memo to President Truman concerning spies, and most definitely to include Harry Dexter White. Obviously, the FBI knew about Harry Dexter White spying in 1945. I have no idea if the Joint Congressional Committee did, despite the fact that the Joint Congressional Committee report was written by an FBI agent. But none of this appears in any Pearl Harbor tribunal. And of course, Venona, verifying Harry Dexter White's espionage, was not declassified until 1995. I'll end this session with this remarkable writing by President Truman in 1956 in his memoir, in which President Truman actually said or wrote, "The country had reason to be proud of and have confidence in our security services. They had kept us almost totally free of espionage during the war." Okay, enough of Harry Dexter White. Onward to President Roosevelt's special assistant and Soviet spy, Launchlin Curie, when we come back in about 15 minutes.